Yeah, I mean, most people are used to doing a lot and getting very little results. So it's definitely appealing if they can do smaller amounts and get a bigger yield or bigger benefit in terms of
Yeah.
health and body composition.
Yeah, and especially when people are limited in the amount of exercise they feel they can do, then why not put in little places, little tactics to try and maximize those benefits?
100%. Can you walk us through how that was set up and what you guys uncovered?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm going to talk about a few studies that I completed throughout my PhD, and the first kind of study of my PhD was some mechanistic work. We were looking at metabolism during exercise, but my supervisor, Dr. Gonzalez, talked about that in season two of your podcast. So I'm not going to touch on that too much today. Instead, I'm going to talk about two other studies. One was an acute short-term study over a period of 24 hours that was primarily focused on energy balance, and we published that in the Journal of Nutrition. And then there was a longer term exercise training study, which took up the majority of time of my PhD. We published that one in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism last year. And
Fantastic.
then at the very end, we can have a chat about a slightly different study that was also quite fun and interesting to do with energy balance as well.
Yeah, teaser maximal eating study. So make sure you just stay tuned.
Yeah, definitely a fun one when we're all eating barbecues.
There you go.
So yeah, I guess we can maybe just delve into that acute study first around energy balance, if you'd like.
Perfect.
Um, so yeah, the acute study, we were basically looking at the effects of skipping breakfast and performing exercise compared to eating breakfast and doing the same exercise on the different components of energy balance that I talked about earlier. So why were we interested in this? Well, quite a lot of people would say they are a breakfast consumer, but there's lots of myths around this. Is eating breakfast good for your health? Is it bad? So, for example, if you survey people and measure their weight, if you're a breakfast consumer, you're typically less likely to be overweight. But you cannot necessarily say that's causal
Hmm.
from those observation studies, and there can be lots of different confounding variables. So the backdrop was a study completed by Professor James Bett at the University of Bath, where he randomized people to either eat breakfast or not, and he looked at different markers of energy balance. And what he showed in a nutshell was that the group that ate breakfast increased their physical activity across the day, and particularly in the morning. So the participants that skipped breakfast, they didn't seem to compensate by eating more later in the day, but there did seem to be a reduction in energy expenditure, which would, so if you were saying, well, I'll skip breakfast to lose weight, um, this reduction in their energy expenditure, if we think back to those weigh-in scales, it would be eating into that energy deficit that they've created.
Yeah, it's fascinating how people wouldn't necessarily assume that and obviously just think, well, listen, I'm going to eat less total calories because I'm going to skip breakfast and therefore I'm going to be able to achieve this outcome that I'm after. But just as you mentioned, these things are interrelated, and all of a sudden now energy expenditure goes down, and our clients are still stuck in that same situation.
Yeah, and it really you've hit the nail on the head there because this reduction in energy expenditure it wasn't it was through non-exercise activity, so things like fidgeting. Perhaps you're less likely to walk to the shops. Maybe those maybe subconscious movements or decisions you don't really think about. That's where these reductions in energy expenditure were coming from. So how did me and Javier talked about this, and we decided it'd be interesting to have an exercise condition in there. So this is what we set up in our study. We recruited 12 healthy in this study young men. They had a body mass index of 23, and they completed three trials in a randomized order. So in one trial, they arrived at our lab and we fed them a breakfast. It was a porridge breakfast, and they simply remained at rest. So that was our control trial.
Hmm.
In a second trial, they ate the same breakfast, but then they performed a bout of cycling exercise, and it was 1 hour at 50% peak power output. And then in a third trial, they actually skipped the breakfast, but still performed exercise. 2 hours later, we fed them a pasta meal for lunch, and then we provided them with a food package to eat outside of the lab. And all the meals they were allowed to eat as much as they would like from the lunch in the lab and from the food package. And we measured what was left over. And then we also measured their energy expenditure from expired gas samples in the lab. And then we looked at combined heart rate accelerometry outside of the lab, so we could measure energy intake and energy expenditure over 24 hours.
Terrific.
Yeah, and what we showed was that energy balance over 24 hours was unsurprisingly most positive in the rest condition. The men were in an energy balance state, so energy intake pretty much equaling energy expenditure in our breakfast and exercise trial. And in the skipping breakfast and exercise trial, the energy balance was minus 400 calories. So they were in an energy deficit. So that kind of is to be expected, given that they were in that energy deficit from breakfast. But the key message from that study was that due to the incomplete compensation for skipping breakfast before exercise, this strategy might create the conditions for greater losses in body mass compared to eating breakfast before exercise. So these men didn't seem to compensate for missing the breakfast by either eating more or doing less activity over this 24-hour period.